Hello again, fight fans, and welcome back to our series with Dr. Margaret Goodman, the founder of the Voluntary Anti-Doping Association, or VADA. This is video 2 in our 5-video series, our interview with her. In this section, we talk about how VADA came together, and we talk about the type of testing they do, which separates them from other testing groups, and the difference between out of competition testing versus in competition testing. What a lot of people don't know, a lot of fans and especially a lot of media don't know, is that the World Anti-Doping Agency, which kind of sets the protocol for all the testing groups, they have a different testing panel for athletes in competition, that's fighters, in boxing terms, that's fighters in a training camp, versus out of competition testing. They have two different panels. VADA has one panel, whether you're in competition or not. They do the same test all year round. So good stuff here in our second part of our 5-video series. I hope you guys like it. So that's how you got interested in this whole thing. How did it come together? And let's talk about also the voluntary aspect of it, because you have 4 officers at VADA and they're non-paid.
No one's paid in VADA except, obviously we pay for the lab services. We pay for the collection agency because, and it sounds like it's not money collection agency, but the doping collection agency. We pay those individuals that go. We also have a scientific advisor, and Dr. Don Catlin, who many consider the father of anti-doping. He's worked with us since our inception. And he was someone that I talked to for about 1.5 years before we even started VADA, because I was so interested in anti-doping and how it could be improved in combat sports. And also I have a wonderful legal expert, Ryan Connolly, who's been with me from the beginning, who is an anti-doping attorney who helped start the UCLA lab for anti-doping, worked with Dr. Catlin. So those individuals are reimbursed for their services, but none of us officers, myself, for all the hours I put in per week, maybe sometimes 20, 30, none of us are, because what we want to do is show that this can work. You know, when I had talked to athletic commissions about expanding their drug testing, money always comes up, but also personnel and the actual process of doing it. It's a very complex process in order to do it correctly, and it has to be done correctly or it's not fair to the fighters. So
and it's so global. The sport's so global.
Exactly.
There's so many moving parts. There's so many commissions and sanctioning organizations. Right. How do you manage all that?
That's not easy. But the bottom line is you have to make it as simple as possible, and you have to do it to the highest standard you can. Otherwise, you can't do it. And so I spent about 1.5 years talking to many anti-doping experts, even talking to fighters, talking to people that have been involved in doping, on how to put something like that together. That is the only way to create something like this. And I know a lot of commissions initially were concerned about what they call third-party doping, and someone from the outside coming in to do testing for them. That makes commissions very nervous initially, and I think they've gotten used to that as the years have gone by. But commissions weren't doing the kind of testing they needed to do on their own, and it wasn't fair. I mean, how if I was a fighter and I'm competing against someone that could be on performance-enhancing drugs, I mean, that's not fair. And it's not fair to the fans. It's not fair to the media, but it's definitely not fair to the fans that watch it. And I think that if you look at sports like professional football or even soccer now, that they're showing those athletes are developing chronic traumatic encephalopathy from head injuries in their sport, not just heading the ball, but, you know, butting into each other, et cetera, falling on the ground, going into the goalpost, et cetera. You're going to find that performance-enhancing drugs are a key component that can be a risk factor for that. So that's kind of how I got into it.
Well, as far as the actual science, we won't go too granular with all the testing, because it'd be way too boring. But as far as the types of tests you do, just high level, it's blood, it's urine. Do you guys do hair samples?
No.
Because
no.
Is that something where the jury's still out with hair samples?
I just think that I you know, first of all, let me stipulate that I am not an anti-doping scientist, and it is a specific specialty that takes years and years, and that's why we have Dr. Catlin with us to answer all of those kinds of questions, and I'm sure he'd be happy to speak to you as well. But I would tell you that most of the tests that are tests that will determine doping violations are urine tests. Very few things are determined from a blood test, but we do blood tests as well. The urine tests have even expanded. The most important thing about working with a World Anti-Doping Agency accredited lab like we do, and that's all we work with, is they're year by year, maybe even month by month, expanding the panels of tests that they do. So there's hundreds of things they'll test for. And as new substances come to light, matter of fact, Dr. Catlin was the one that discovered THG, the substance that was implicated in the Balco investigation and all of that. He was the one to determine the testing for that. So I think it's important to work with those kinds of experts that understand anti-doping. I can tell you in the beginning, because VADA was voluntary, people were very wary because they think that that athletes that are volunteering for doping may be trying to beat the system to see what they can get away with. So we had to really follow very set standards. We spent about 1.5 years creating our own policies and procedures. Some of them are close to what WADA recommends. We're not a WADA signatory or under WADA, not us so much because we're not an actual agency that adjudicates results, but no boxing commission is under WADA because they're not WADA signatories. They have their own rules and regulations. They may say they follow this or that, but professional boxing, it would be very hard for them to be a WADA signatory for a lot of different reasons, but also because of the suspensions that are given that maybe don't really fit professional boxing or MMA, and you can see that with the testing that the UFC is doing now. But at any rate, that was how that came about. I had to spend a lot of time and understanding the different categories of drugs, but I really defer to the experts that I work with.
Smart.
Yeah.
It's sometimes just better to let those guys answer the questions. So the carbon isotope test and all that, is that probably the gold standard test right now? Is that the best for synthetic testosterone?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
It has actually a longer name because the test has been redeveloped. And actually the individual that worked with us, Dr. Catlin, and there was another doctor that we worked with for a period of time that's worked with several WADA accredited labs and was at UCLA at that time to help develop that test, Dr. Aguilera. It's now got another name, letters are IRMS, and that's a test to really detect synthetic testosterone. And the one good thing about VADA is I think our testing profiles are very extensive, and we do that test on every single collection. We also test for erythropoietin, for blood doping on every collection. So I think one thing about VADA that's different, one thing that I can specifically state that's different from any other agency or association that does anti-doping tests is we do not have an out-of-competition panel. All of the substances that are on our prohibited list, the athletes can be tested from them at any time. If you look at the WADA list, they have prohibited substances that are always prohibited in competition, some that are prohibited in and out of competition. We only have one list. So for example, stimulants and narcotics. Any athlete in our program is not allowed to use those unless they were to apply for a therapeutic use exemption for some unknown reason. They're eligible to be tested for all of that.
So let's talk about that nuance with WADA. Because there are a lot of fighters that fight twice a year. Maybe it's May, maybe it's September. But in between those fight camps, per WADA protocol, there are certain substances they can use, and then when they're back in competition testing, they can't. With you guys, they can't use anything at any time. Because that's one thing a lot of fans ask about is, well, okay, you guys are testing them 8 weeks before a fight, but what about 6 months before a fight? They could be using something and cycling off. So is that part of the clean boxing program, where you're supposed to hopefully catch some of that stuff going on?
Right, and it's like Dr. Silva talked about, it's not so much about catching the athlete, it's about educating them and promoting clean sport. And I don't really like to think of it as that we're policing anything, because we're really not doing that. We're really just trying to create a level playing field. So yes, to answer your question, in which I'm doing in a roundabout way, is the most important thing would be year-round testing, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and that's what we recommend, and that's what the clean boxing program is about.
I think the only fighter that I can think of that openly volunteered for that before anyone else was Nonito Donaire,
Yes,
right?
for 2 years straight, he did.
That set the gold standard. Is the cleanest guy in all the sport. Let's see, what else? Have you seen differences between boxers versus MMA fighters? Do you see certain trends when it comes to the what you're popping fighters for, what they're testing positive for, or is it all pretty much the same, or do you see a difference?
I think it's pretty much the same. I think the moment you start increasing the frequency of testing, as far as having athletes that are in a year-round program, you're going to kind of see the same things. I used to think there was a huge difference. I used to believe, I used to hear this all the time as well, that boxers would never use performance-enhancing drugs, and, MMA fighters were different, and, why would they, blah, blah, blah. Boxers don't think that way. But I think it's pretty much all the same. Everyone wants a leg up or an advantage, and why wouldn't we? We all want that in our own lives, so why wouldn't it when it comes to an athletic endeavor like boxing? It's so tough.